The morning air was cold enough to sting as Emily Torres adjusted her uniform collar and tightened the Velcro strap on her vest. The crisp navy fabric still smelled faintly of newness, a scent that carried both pride and fear. It was her first official day on patrol as an officer of the Brookvale Police Department. Years of training, late nights studying, physical endurance tests, and emotional resilience had all led to this moment. The station buzzed with early morning activity. Radios crackled, boots echoed against tiled floors, and the aroma of burnt coffee mixed with engine oil and paperwork. Emily had dreamed of this since she was a little girl, sitting on her father's shoulders during the annual police parade. Her father, a construction worker, had always told her that law enforcement was a noble calling. To serve, to protect, to stand tall even when the world turned its back on you. But dreams, she would soon learn, were softer than reality. The moment she stepped into the locker room, the hum of conversation quieted. A few glances darted her way, some curious, others skeptical. The department had only 2 female officers before her, both long gone. She was the new experiment, as one of the senior sergeants had murmured during her training rotation. Still, she smiled, steady and polite. She'd worked too hard to let nerves betray her. When roll call began, she stood in the back row, listening closely to assignments. Her name was paired with that of Sergeant Mark Reynolds, a veteran officer with 20 years on the force and a reputation for being old school. Emily had heard of him long before today. The stories circulated like urban legends among recruits. He was tough, disciplined, and not particularly fond of changes in the department, especially when those changes came wearing a ponytail and mascara. When he saw her approach the patrol car, his expression didn't shift. He was a man of rigid posture and hard edges, his gray flecked hair matching the steel in his tone. Without words, he handed her the clipboard for the first log entry. As they rolled out of the parking lot, the city was waking up, streets filling with commuters, shopkeepers unlocking doors, the morning sun cutting through layers of fog. Emily sat in silence, the hum of the engine filling the space between them. She could sense his skepticism, feel it hanging heavy in the air like an unspoken accusation. At first, she tried to break the silence, asking about the route, about recent cases. But every attempt was met with curt, dismissive responses. Eventually, she stopped trying. By mid-morning, they had responded to 2 minor calls, an abandoned vehicle and a noise complaint. Emily handled herself well, following procedure, documenting details precisely as she'd been trained. But every time she spoke on the radio, she could feel Mark's disapproval beside her, his jaw tightening slightly as if her voice itself was an inconvenience. During lunch, he didn't sit with her. He joined a group of senior officers instead, laughing at stories from the old days while Emily sat alone in the corner of the cafeteria, quietly eating her sandwich. The laughter carried across the room, booming, unrestrained, and punctuated by words that made her skin prickle. They talked about her, not by name but by implication. The new diversity hire, the quota recruit, the pretty face in a badge. Each phrase cut deeper than the last. She wanted to believe it didn't matter, that their words were just noise. But deep down, she could feel the sting of being reduced to something she wasn't, a symbol instead of a person. The day dragged on, and fatigue began to set in. They responded to another call just before dusk, a domestic disturbance in a run-down apartment complex. Emily followed protocol, approaching cautiously, her hand hovering near her holster. The situation was tense, a shouting match between a couple that quickly escalated when the man lunged toward the woman. Emily acted instinctively. She stepped between them, restrained the man, and calmed the woman down while backup was called. Her composure was unshaken, her voice firm but calm. It was exactly how she'd been trained to handle it. When the suspect was taken into custody, Mark said nothing. Not a word of acknowledgement. But later, as they filed the report, she caught a flicker in his expression, a momentary pause as he watched her type with methodical precision. It wasn't respect yet, but it wasn't disdain either. It was something in between. Still, the shift ended without so much as a nod. As she changed out of her gear, the other officers joked about babysitting the new girl. She smiled politely, hiding the exhaustion behind practiced calm. That night, alone in her small apartment, Emily lay awake staring at the ceiling. Her body ached, but her mind hurt more. She had expected challenges, yes, but not this quiet kind of cruelty. Not the subtle rejection that came with every smirk, every glance that said you don't belong here. But she also knew she couldn't quit. Not now. Not after everything. The next day, she walked back into the station determined to prove herself. Not to them, but to herself. She didn't need validation from men who mocked what they didn't understand. She needed experience. She needed time. And as fate would have it, time was about to test her in ways she never imagined. Because before the week was over, a call would come in. One that would change everything. A robbery in progress. A suspect armed and dangerous. And when it was over, the story of Officer Torres would no longer be a whisper in the hallways. It would become the talk of the entire department. The rain came down hard that night, slicing through the darkness in heavy sheets that turned the streets of Brookvale into slick, gleaming mirrors. The air was thick with static, the kind that precedes chaos, an electric tension that settled over the city like a warning. Emily Torres sat in the passenger seat of the patrol car, her hands folded in her lap as the windshield wipers struggled to keep up with the storm. It had been a long day, quiet, uneventful, marked only by traffic citations and the occasional petty theft. Sergeant Reynolds drove in silence, his eyes fixed on the road, his jawline taut beneath the glow of the dashboard lights. Then the radio crackled. Unit 12, we've got a 1031 in progress at Brookvale Savings on 3rd and Maple. Possible armed suspect. Multiple hostages reported. Emily's pulse spiked. A bank robbery. It was the kind of high-risk call that every officer trained for, but few faced so early in their careers. Mark's eyes flicked toward her for a fraction of a second, then back to the road. Without a word, he hit the siren, and the car lurched forward, lights flashing red and blue through the torrent of rain. As they neared the bank, the chaos unfolded before them, flashing police lights, a barricade forming, officers taking cover behind squad cars. The night air vibrated with the sound of shouted orders and distant cries. Emily could see the glow of the bank's interior through shattered glass. Figures crouched low inside, hostages huddled near teller counters, and one man pacing with a gun in his hand. She felt the weight of the moment settle on her shoulders. Every breath seemed louder, every movement slower. Sergeant Reynolds barked orders into the radio, coordinating with dispatch. Emily stayed focused, scanning the perimeter, assessing lines of sight, exits, and cover points. Training took over, pushing fear to the edges of her mind. The rain made everything harder. The slick ground, the muffled sound of movement, the glare from wet lights. The team moved cautiously, forming a perimeter around the bank's entrance. Then, as negotiators tried to make contact, a sudden shout echoed from inside. A gunshot followed. The sound was deafening. Without hesitation, Emily reacted. She sprinted forward, crouching behind a concrete barrier, her weapon drawn. She could see through the shattered doorway now. The gunman waving his pistol, yelling, adrenaline painting his movements erratic and wild. A woman was on the ground near him, clutching her arm, blood seeping through her sleeve. Mark hissed a curse under his breath, signaling for backup, but Emily was already moving. It was instinct, pure, unfiltered training. She ducked low, slipping inside through a side door that hung ajar. Her heart thundered, but her grip was steady. Inside, the air was thick with panic and fear. The gunman's voice echoed off marble walls, incoherent, furious. He hadn't seen her yet. She edged closer, staying behind an overturned desk. Through the chaos, she saw the hostage's eyes, terrified, pleading. She knew she had to act before he noticed her. Then the man turned abruptly, aiming his weapon at one of the hostages. In that split second, Emily stood, aimed, and fired. The echo rang through the bank like thunder. The suspect collapsed instantly, the gun clattering to the floor. Silence followed, heavy and absolute. The hostages froze, eyes wide, breaths trembling. The only sound was the rain hammering against the glass. Seconds later, officers poured in from the front entrance, weapons raised. Mark was among them, his eyes finding Emily in the center of the room, her weapon still drawn, her face unreadable. For the first time since she'd joined the department, he looked at her not as a rookie, not as a woman, but as an officer who had just saved a dozen lives. But admiration didn't come easily in Brookvale PD. The next morning, the department was buzzing. The story had already made the news. Young female officer ends bank standoff, saves hostages. Reporters gathered outside the station. The local mayor praised her publicly, and even the chief congratulated her in front of the squad during roll call. Yet, beneath the applause, there was tension. Some officers were genuinely proud. Others, not so much. Emily could feel it. The hushed voices behind her back, the dismissive glances from those who couldn't stand seeing her succeed. "She got lucky?" one whispered. A rookie like her shouldn't have even been inside. Media loves her. Another muttered. Good PR for the department. Even Mark seemed uneasy, caught between the department's old culture and the undeniable reality of what had happened. He avoided eye contact, spoke little, and left the room whenever her name came up. That night, when Emily returned home, she sat in silence for a long time. The adrenaline from the day before had faded, replaced by a hollow exhaustion. She knew she had done everything right, followed protocol, saved lives. But somehow, the recognition she received felt tainted. She wasn't being celebrated as a capable officer. She was being used as a symbol, a token of progress in a system that still didn't believe in her. Still, she refused to let bitterness win. She reminded herself that she hadn't joined for praise or attention. She joined because she believed in something deeper, because every girl who dreamed of serving deserved to see someone who looked like her in uniform. Days turned into weeks. The incident slowly faded from headlines, replaced by the next crisis, the next crime. But within the department, whispers persisted. Promotions were discussed, rumors that Emily's name was being considered for a commendation. To her, it was just a rumor. To others, it was a threat. Mark began acting distant, colder than usual. It wasn't the silence of indifference anymore. It was the silence of conflict. The unspoken realization that everything he had once believed about women in uniform was beginning to unravel before his eyes. Then, one evening, as Emily was finishing her shift, she was called into the chief's office. The chief, a stoic man with a deep voice and sharp eyes, handed her a letter. It wasn't a commendation. It was a transfer order. Effective immediately, she was being reassigned to administrative duty. No explanation, no discussion. The words blurred on the page as she read them again and again. It didn't make sense. She had done everything right. She had earned her place on the field. But as she looked up, she saw Mark standing just outside the glass, paneled office door, his expression hard, unreadable. And in that moment, Emily understood. The department wasn't ready for her. But one day they would be, and when that day came, they would have no choice but to salute her. The hum of fluorescent lights filled the small, gray-walled office where Emily Torres now spent her days. The sound had a way of seeping into her thoughts, dulling them, making every hour feel like a slow erasure of purpose. Her new post, administrative assistant to the operations division, was less a promotion and more a punishment disguised as paperwork. She sat behind a desk piled with reports, accident logs, and equipment requisitions that no one else wanted to process. Outside her door, she could hear the rhythm of boots on tile, the low rumble of laughter from the officers heading out on patrol. Every sound reminded her of what she had lost. The rush of adrenaline, the pulse of duty, the sense of belonging to something real. They hadn't even bothered to give her a reason. Reassignment due to departmental restructuring, the memo had said. But Emily knew what it meant. She had embarrassed the wrong people. Her success, instead of being celebrated, had become an uncomfortable mirror for the department's biases. In the weeks that followed, she kept her head down. Every morning she arrived before sunrise, filed reports, answered calls, logged evidence, and left after dark. She told herself it was temporary, that the storm would pass. But as days turned into months, the silence of the office became a kind of prison. The other officers barely looked her in the eye anymore. Some avoided her entirely, afraid to be seen as taking sides. Others muttered comments under their breath, loud enough for her to hear but quiet enough to deny. She should have been disciplined for going in without orders, one said. She's only here because of the headlines, said another. The chief never intervened. Neither did Sergeant Reynolds. Mark was still on active patrol, still commanding respect among the rank and file. Emily saw him occasionally, passing through the halls exchanging curt nods. His eyes held a weight she couldn't decipher. Guilt, maybe, or shame, but he said nothing. And in the silence, his absence spoke volumes. Her career, it seemed, had been neatly boxed away, out of sight, out of mind. But there were moments, fleeting, fragile moments, when that old fire flickered again. Like when she read reports detailing poor response times or mishandled evidence, or disciplinary incidents that could have been avoided with proper leadership. It infuriated her to see how carelessly things were being run, how officers who mocked her competence were the same ones cutting corners, making mistakes that endangered others. She began to notice patterns. A series of misfiled reports, discrepancies in budget allocations, missing inventory logs. It wasn't just incompetence, it was something else, something deliberate. And the more she dug, the uglier it got. It started with a single missing body camera, a small oversight easily explained. But then there were 3 more, then entire boxes of equipment marked as damaged, but never logged for disposal. She traced serial numbers, compared purchase orders, and realized that several items listed as replaced had never been bought in the first place. Money was being moved quietly, disguised as equipment expenses. Thousands of dollars, siphoned out through fake invoices and signed approvals. At first, she thought she was mistaken. But the deeper she went, the clearer it became. Someone in the department was using internal chaos as cover. She documented everything, every number, every name, every discrepancy. She knew she was walking a dangerous line. If anyone found out what she was doing, she could be suspended or worse. But she couldn't ignore it. And then one night, while going through archived records, she saw something that made her blood run cold. One of the authorizing signatures on the fraudulent reports belonged to Sergeant Mark Reynolds. For a long moment, she couldn't move. The man who had dismissed her, undermined her, quietly orchestrated her downfall. He was also stealing from the department. Her first instinct was disbelief. Maybe it was a mistake, a forged signature. But as she cross-referenced more files, the pattern was unmistakable. The same handwriting, the same approval codes. It was him. Her mind raced. Should she report it immediately? Should she confront him? Or should she collect more proof first? The rational part of her knew she needed to be cautious. The department's loyalty ran deep, and many still viewed Reynolds as a hero. If she came forward too soon, she'd be accused of revenge or fabrication. So she waited, and she watched. She started staying late, waiting for the station to quiet down before accessing locked records. She memorized shift schedules, noted which officers were on duty, and carefully avoided anyone who might question her presence. She hid her notes in an encrypted folder on her home laptop, keeping backups on a flash drive she wore around her neck. But secrets have a way of slipping through cracks. One evening, as she was leaving the station, she noticed something strange. Her car door was slightly ajar. Inside, the glove compartment was open, her notebooks missing. Her heart pounded as she looked around the parking lot, but it was empty. Just rain tapping on asphalt. She filed a quiet report about a possible vehicle break-in, but told no one what had been taken. The next morning, she arrived at work to find her desk drawer unlocked and her documents rearranged. Someone knew. She tried to act normal, but fear began to creep into her every move. Every time she passed Mark in the hallway, she felt his gaze linger. Not long enough to accuse him of anything, but long enough to remind her that he still held power. Still, she refused to back down. Over the next few weeks, she gathered everything she could: emails, purchase records, and approval forms linking Reynolds to multiple illicit transactions. It was meticulous, dangerous work, but it gave her something she hadn't felt in months: purpose. Then, one Friday afternoon, she received a message from an anonymous number. "You're digging in the wrong places. Stop before it gets worse." She stared at the screen for a long time, her pulse echoing in her ears. That night, she didn't go home. Instead, she drove to a nearby diner, opened her laptop, and uploaded copies of her findings to a secure online folder. If anything happened to her, the evidence would still exist. For the first time since being sidelined, she felt in control again. She wasn't just surviving, she was fighting back. But the fight was far from over. Because on Monday morning, she would walk into the chief's office and expose the corruption that had poisoned the very department she once admired. And she knew, deep down, that when she did, there would be no turning back. The following Monday began like any other, the gray dawn creeping reluctantly across Brookvale as rain pattered against the police station windows. Inside, the rhythm of the morning shift was familiar: phones ringing, radios crackling, officers exchanging wary greetings over steaming cups of coffee. But for Emily Torres, everything felt different. Every sound, every glance, every breath carried an undercurrent of tension. She wasn't just clocking in for another day of filing reports. She was about to expose a corruption scheme that reached deep into the very heart of her department. She had spent the weekend rehearsing what she would say, running through every possible outcome in her mind. Fear had kept her awake most nights, but so had resolve. She had joined the police to protect people, to seek justice. And now, that justice began here, even if it cost her everything. Clutching the flash drive in her pocket, she walked through the narrow corridor toward the chief's office. The hallway seemed longer than usual, each step echoing too loudly against the floor. Officers passed her with polite nods, unaware of the storm that was about to break over them. The chief's secretary looked up as Emily approached. Her face showed mild surprise. Few people requested private meetings with the chief without warning. After a brief pause, she buzzed him on the intercom. "Chief, Officer Torres is here. She says it's urgent." A muffled voice responded, and the door clicked open. Inside, the chief sat behind his desk, his hands folded, his expression unreadable. He gestured for her to sit. Emily took a steady breath and began. She spoke clearly, carefully, explaining everything she had discovered. The missing body cameras, the falsified expense reports, the duplicate invoices. She laid out the evidence methodically, showing how each piece led back to Sergeant Reynolds. Her voice shook at times, but she didn't stop. When she finished, she slid the flash drive across the desk. For a long moment, the chief said nothing. His eyes scanned the documents she had printed, his brow furrowed slightly. Then, without a word, he leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. It was impossible to read him. Finally, he spoke in a measured tone. "You understand the gravity of what you're alleging, Officer Torres?" She nodded. He continued, "If what you're saying is true, this could have serious implications for the department, and for you. You'll be questioned, scrutinized, even targeted. Are you prepared for that?" Her reply was simple. "I'm prepared for the truth." He studied her for another long moment, then pressed a button on his desk phone. "Internal Affairs," he said quietly. "Send someone up." Within minutes, 2 plainclothes investigators entered the room. They collected her files, took her statement, and assured her that an internal review would begin immediately. The process, they said, would take time. They asked her to remain discreet, to continue her duties as usual while they verified the information. Emily agreed, though she knew what discreet really meant silence. As she left the office, she could feel eyes following her. Rumors spread fast in the department, and she could already sense the shift in atmosphere. Conversations hushed when she entered a room. Fellow officers avoided her in the cafeteria. Even friends who once chatted easily now offered only cautious nods. By noon, the whispers began. Torres went to Internal Affairs. She's turning on the department. She's trying to take Reynolds down. The words crawled through the station like smoke, invisible but suffocating. Mark Reynolds didn't confront her directly, not at first. But his presence was impossible to ignore. He loomed in hallways, his gaze sharp, his silence heavy. She knew he was aware. He always seemed to know everything that happened within these walls. One afternoon, as she passed the locker room, she found a note taped to her locker. The handwriting was rough, hurried. "Snitches don't last long here." Her stomach turned, but she tore it down and kept walking. She refused to show fear. Days turned into weeks. The internal investigation moved quietly, methodically. Emily was called in several times to clarify details, provide additional documentation, and identify signatures. Each meeting left her drained but resolute. She knew she was doing the right thing even if it isolated her completely. But corruption rarely goes down quietly. Late one evening, as she was preparing to leave, she noticed her computer screen flicker. Files she had saved were missing. Folders she had carefully hidden, wiped clean. She tried restoring them, but they were gone. Someone had accessed her system remotely. A cold chill ran through her. She knew then that whoever she had exposed wasn't just trying to discredit her. They were trying to erase her. The next morning, Internal Affairs called her in again. They had questions, urgent ones. One of the files she'd submitted had been flagged as incomplete and altered. The implication was clear. Someone was trying to frame her for tampering with evidence. The investigators looked skeptical now. Their tone had changed. She tried to explain, but without her backup data, she had little proof left to defend herself. That night, sitting alone in her apartment, Emily's faith began to waver. She had done everything right, followed every rule, and still, the system was turning on her. She thought about resigning, about walking away from a place that had never truly welcomed her. But then, she remembered the victims she'd helped, the woman she'd protected during the bank robbery, the children who waved when they saw her patrol car, the little girl who once pointed and said, "Mommy, look, a lady cop." That was who she was fighting for, not the corrupt, not the fearful, but the hopeful. So she began again from scratch. She rebuilt her case using copies she'd kept on a private cloud drive. She gathered statements from procurement officers, receipts from vendors, and financial records from city archives. Bit by bit, The truth resurfaced, stronger than before. And then, just as she was preparing to resubmit the full evidence package, something unexpected happened. An envelope appeared on her desk, no name, no return address. Inside was a USB drive. When she plugged it into her computer, the files opened instantly. Surveillance footage, security logs, and on one of the videos, clear as daylight, was Sergeant Reynolds himself, signing off on the falsified shipment forms, handing them to a subordinate, pocketing cash from an envelope. Her breath caught in her throat. It was the final piece, the proof that couldn't be denied or erased. But before she could decide what to do next, her office phone rang. The caller ID read Sergeant M. Reynolds. The sound of the ringing filled the room, each tone sharp as a blade. Her hand hovered over the receiver, frozen. Was it a warning, a trap, or something else entirely? The phone rang again, and as she finally reached out to answer, a single thought burned in her mind. Whatever happened next, there was no going back. The phone's shrill ring cut through the silence of the office, each pulse vibrating through Emily's hand as she finally picked it up. For a brief second, she couldn't find her voice. The line hissed faintly, alive with static and storm. Then came the sound of breathing, slow, deliberate, heavy. "Officer Torres?" said the familiar, gravel-edged voice of Sergeant Reynolds. "We need to talk." He didn't threaten her. He didn't yell. The calmness in his tone was worse. It was the kind of voice that carried control, the kind that knew fear worked better when whispered. Before she could respond, the line clicked dead. Her pulse raced. The office suddenly felt smaller, the air too thin. Every shadow in the corners of the room seemed alive. She sat there for several minutes, staring at the silent receiver, trying to steady her breath. That evening, she drove home under a sky smeared with gray clouds, her windshield streaked with drizzle. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than usual. She told herself it was over, that she had the proof now, that the video was enough to end it all. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. People like Mark Reynolds didn't fall easily. He was woven into the department's fabric, respected, feared, protected. His influence stretched far beyond his patrol unit. If she went to internal affairs again, she'd be fighting not just him, but everyone who'd spent years turning a blind eye. Still, she couldn't stop now. The evidence was too damning to ignore. The footage had to be submitted immediately, before it could vanish like everything else. She copied the files onto 2 separate drives, hiding one beneath the floorboard in her apartment. The other, she sealed in an envelope and tucked into her jacket pocket. Then, as the rain intensified outside, she stared out her window and whispered to herself a single promise: tomorrow, this ends. But tomorrow came differently than she imagined. When she arrived at the station the next morning, the air was unusually quiet. The chatter that normally filled the halls was gone. Instead, officers lingered in corners whispering, glancing at her as she passed. Something had shifted, and then she saw it. Her locker stood open, the metal door bent slightly at the hinge. Inside, her belongings were scattered. The few personal items she kept at work, her files, even the photo of her parents. Everything had been tossed out. Spray painted across the back of the locker in jagged black letters were 2 words that made her stomach twist. TRAITARATE. She froze, her body rigid, her mind blank. A few officers nearby stopped, pretending not to look. No one spoke. No one helped. The silence screamed louder than any insult could. For the first time since joining the force, she felt truly alone. The chief's secretary appeared moments later, her face pale. "The chief wants to see you. Now." Emily walked into his office to find internal affairs already there. The chief sat behind his desk, his expression unreadable. One of the investigators gestured for her to sit. They told her someone had leaked details of the investigation. Names, dates, accusations, all of it. The information was now spreading through the department and online. They couldn't confirm how it got out, but they knew she had accessed confidential files. The implication was clear. She was being blamed. Emily's heart pounded. "That's not possible," she insisted, her voice shaking. "I followed every protocol. I didn't share." The investigator cut her off. "We'll need your computer and your phone. Until this is resolved, you're being placed on temporary suspension." The words hit her like a physical blow. Suspension. They were silencing her before she could finish what she'd started. She wanted to fight back, to shout that they were protecting the wrong person. But she saw the futility in their eyes. They had already chosen sides. As she handed over her badge and gun, a wave of nausea rose in her throat. Everything she'd worked for, every ounce of pride she had built, was being stripped away in seconds. She walked out of the station under the weight of 100 stares. No one said a word. No one stopped her. She was invisible again, but this time, painfully so. Outside, the air smelled like rain and exhaust. She climbed into her car and sat there for a long while, the city blurring through tears she refused to let fall. She had wanted to expose corruption. Instead, she had been branded as the problem. But the fight wasn't over. Not yet. Later that night, as the city slept, Emily drove across town to a small cafe that stayed open 24 hours. She sat in the back corner booth, laptop open, nursing a coffee gone cold. She still had the backup drive, the one hidden in her apartment. The files on it could clear her name and destroy Reynolds completely. But she couldn't trust anyone in the department now. She needed to take it higher, beyond the chief, beyond internal affairs. So she drafted an email to a local investigative journalist she followed, one known for exposing corruption in law enforcement. She attached the files, the video footage, and a brief statement describing everything that had happened. Her finger hovered over the send button. For a moment, she hesitated. If she did this, her career would be over. The department would turn against her entirely. But maybe that was the price of truth. She hit send. The message went out into the digital void, small and silent but powerful. Over the next few days, nothing happened. No response, no acknowledgement. The silence gnawed at her nerves. Had she made a mistake? Had the email even gone through? Then, on the fourth morning, it happened. The story broke online. Corruption scandal rocks Brookvale PD. Evidence points to Senior Sergeant. Within hours, it was everywhere. News vans crowded outside the precinct, cameras flashing, reporters shouting questions. The video of Reynolds signing off fraudulent forms played on every screen, his face unmistakable. The department scrambled to respond. Internal Affairs reopened the investigation. The chief issued a statement promising full transparency. Officers who had once mocked her now avoided her name entirely, pretending they'd never doubted her. But Emily knew it wasn't over. That afternoon, as she left her apartment, she noticed a black sedan parked across the street. It had been there all morning. Its engine idled quietly, exhaust curling into the air. A man sat behind the wheel watching her. Their eyes met through the rain-streaked glass, and in that split second, she understood. Reynolds wasn't finished. He had lost control of the department, but not of himself. He was coming for her. The black sedan stayed parked across the street for 3 days. It became part of the scenery, still, quiet, menacing. Emily knew better than to assume coincidence. She recognized the tinted windows, the way the driver never left, the way the car would disappear just before dawn and return after sunset. It was the kind of intimidation tactic she had seen used on victims before. Only now, she was the one being hunted. Sleep came in fragments. Every creak of her apartment building, every footstep in the hallway made her jolt awake. Her body ached from constant vigilance. She barely ate. The constant weight of paranoia was suffocating. But beneath it, there was something else, a spark, a fierce and steady flame of defiance. She had fought too hard to let fear win now. On the morning of the 4th day, Emily dressed carefully. Black blazer, crisp white shirt, hair tied neatly beneath her regulation cap. She wasn't an officer anymore, not technically, but she still carried herself like one. The news outlets had begun running new segments. The investigation into Brookvale PD had expanded. The district attorney was now involved, and although the chief had tried to downplay her role, the truth was already out there. The city knew her name, and so did Mark Reynolds. She decided that if he wanted a confrontation, he would get one, on her terms. Emily drove straight to the station, ignoring the whispers and stares that followed as she walked through the front doors. The air buzzed with tension. Reporters camped outside shouted questions. Cameras flashed through the rain-streaked glass. Officers hurried down the halls, avoiding her gaze. When she reached the chief's office, she didn't wait for permission. She walked in. The chief looked up from a pile of documents, his face drawn and wary. He had aged visibly in the past week. The weight of the scandal had settled heavily on his shoulders. He didn't ask her to sit. Instead, he closed the folder before him and exhaled. "It's over, Emily," he said quietly. "Reynolds has been suspended pending charges. Internal Affairs confirmed the footage. The DA's office is building a case. You did what none of us could, or maybe what none of us dared." For a moment, she just stood there, taking in the words. The vindication she had fought for was finally within reach. But it didn't feel like victory. Not yet. The chief's expression darkened. You need to know something? He continued. Reynolds didn't act alone. There were others, superiors, people above even me, who benefited from his operations. This investigation isn't just about one corrupt sergeant. It's about the entire structure that protected him. The revelation hit her like a cold wave. It wasn't just about Reynolds. It never had been. It was about a system that rewarded silence, punished integrity, and allowed prejudice to thrive under a badge. As she left the office, a murmur swept through the hallway. Officers clustered near the break room television. The live news broadcast showed Reynolds being led out of his home in handcuffs. His once perfect hair was disheveled, his expression a mixture of rage and disbelief. Reporters shouted his name, flashes erupted like fireworks. For the first time, she saw him not as a predator, but as prey. Justice had begun its slow, grinding work. But Emily wasn't naive. She knew how fragile justice could be. People like Reynolds often found loopholes, connections, sympathy. She had seen men like him wriggle free time and again. So she stayed vigilant, following every update, submitting additional evidence, cooperating with investigators. She refused to disappear quietly as so many before her had. The weeks that followed were a blur of hearings and interviews. The city's trust in its police department crumbled. Protests formed outside City Hall. Officers resigned. Old cases were reopened. The chief himself faced scrutiny for failing to act sooner. And through it all, Emily's name kept surfacing, not as a traitor, but as a whistleblower, a reformer, a symbol. The media painted her as the woman who stood against a wall of corruption and didn't flinch. But beneath the praise, she carried scars that words couldn't heal. The memories of being mocked, isolated, dismissed. The pain of proving herself over and over again in a place that never wanted her. It wasn't pride that fueled her now. It was purpose. A few months later, a city council meeting was called. The chief announced his retirement, his voice cracking slightly as he admitted his failures. In the same breath, he introduced a new initiative, a reform plan for the department aimed at rebuilding integrity, diversity, and community trust. And then, in a moment that sent ripples through the room, he announced his successor. Effective immediately, he said, his gaze steady, the new chief of police for the Brookvale department will be Emily Torres. The room erupted into stunned murmurs. Cameras flashed. Reporters scrambled. Emily sat frozen for a heartbeat, disbelief washing over her. The same station that had once humiliated her, suspended her, turned its back on her, was now placing its future in her hands. As she stood to accept the appointment, she looked across the crowd of officers. Some ashamed, some proud, others skeptical. But none of that mattered. She wasn't doing this for their approval. She was doing it for the people outside those walls, the ones who had lost faith in the system. Her first act as chief was to overhaul internal oversight and implement mandatory diversity and ethics training. She reopened closed misconduct cases, reached out to communities that had long been ignored, and promoted deserving officers who had been overlooked for years. One of them was a young recruit, a woman, fresh out of the academy, who wore her hair under a hijab with quiet pride. As Emily handed her the badge, she saw herself reflected in that hopeful smile, and something deep inside her finally began to heal. Months later, during a press conference marking her first 100 days as chief, a familiar figure appeared at the back of the room. Dressed in civilian clothes, gaunt and subdued, Mark Reynolds stood among the crowd. His eyes met hers, no longer filled with arrogance, but with something closer to regret. He had taken a plea deal to avoid prison, and as part of it, he was required to perform community service under departmental supervision. Ironically, that meant working at the same station he had once ruled. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Emily watched as he quietly swept the floors after hours, the man who once claimed women didn't belong in uniform now taking orders from one. Karma had a way of balancing its scales slowly, silently, but perfectly. And yet, she didn't gloat. Because real victory wasn't about revenge. It was about change. Late one evening, as she stood by her office window overlooking the city, the lights shimmering against the glass, Emily reflected on the journey that had brought her here. Every insult, every betrayal, every night spent wondering if it was all worth it, had built the foundation for this moment. She had once been told that women didn't belong in the police. Now, she was the police. Outside, the city's sirens wailed softly in the distance, a sound she had learned not to fear, but to respect. It wasn't chaos. It was the heartbeat of a city still learning, still healing. And somewhere deep inside that rhythm, Emily Torres finally found peace.